First of all, I'd like to say thank you to John for inviting me here, and thank you to all for coming today. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the BSA, somewhere where I've come to think of as a home away from home over the last few years. I've given a couple of presentations, parts of workshops here in the past, and it really is a haven for me in the middle of this crazy city. So thank you for coming, and thank you to John for that introduction as well. So yeah, as John was saying, I've been working on economy, temporality, and historical consciousness in Trikala actually since 2003, both as a student and then in my postdoc years. And the research straddles both sides of the outbreak of economic crisis. So I was actually in the field when the crisis surfaced from out of the blue. So I went to do research, first of all, on small businesses in Trikala, and whilst I was there, the crisis broke out, and I sort of captured how people were thinking and talking about this emergent stage. And since then, I've been working on my most recent project on things like new extractive economies, diversification programs for agriculturalists in Thessaly. So throughout the research, I've been looking at how the Greek economic crisis has stimulated temporal thought, or temporality, whether tilted in the direction of historicizing, presentifying, or futural thought, and how people rethink their relationships with time as provoked by the crisis. And my first idea of a paper tonight was going to be to recap the book, this History, Time and Economic Crisis, and perhaps read a bit from the introduction, read a chapter, and sort of give you an idea of what the book was about. But I realized that actually is some of my work in the past, and I wanted to give a paper which I have never given before to actually get some feedback on some new ideas. So first of all, I will just summarize briefly what the book is about and the context for today's paper. So the book goes through many different ways of which different moments, selective moments of the past, moments of history, have become important to how people understand the crisis today. Selective moments of the past which can be quite distant in linear time, how they're actually picked out and used to make meaningful sense out of some of the social change, some of the dramatic change which is going on during the economic crisis, and also how people start to imagine their futures based on very selective interpretations of the past. So things can be knitted and stitched together, bits of the past, moments of the past, epochs, in order for people to actually understand their life, their changing lives today. So some examples of these in the book is how diversification programs towards renewable energy on the plains of Thessaly have awoken feelings of neocolonialism and occupation akin to the Ottoman Chifligadas. So these great plains of Thessaly, which were Chiflikia back in up until 1881, after 1881 even, when Thessaly was annexed to the Greek state, people are talking about the late Ottoman Chiflikia again. They're feeling dispossessed, like their land is being taken away. A new occupation, this time by German photovoltaic developers who are asking them to give over their land in return for rent. That was another part of the book that deals on narratives of World War II and Axis occupation and how people are feeling they're reliving a new form of occupation, again with similar foes. It also talks about how protest slogans have historical reference in them, protest slogans which have been taken from different historical epochs, and they've resurfaced now and people are talking about them in protest and in everyday life, and how this is sort of knitting together these pasts with the present. There's also the idea, which comes out strongly in the book, is what I was going to talk about first of all today, was the idea of returning to times of hunger as akin to the Great Famine of 1941 to 43, and the fears of local people about having to deal with hunger and perhaps the resurfacing of the same time of famine that their parents, grandparents experienced in the 1940s. And why that is interesting in the case of Trikala is that actually their grandfathers didn't experience the Great Famine in the same way as it was experienced in Athens. It was the effects of the Great Famine in 41-43 were not particularly significant. The livelihood strategies that they had, the subsistence farming, the resource sharing, actually meant they got through the Great Famine without much loss of life. But real accounts, nationalised accounts through the education system, through public and popular culture, things like theatre, poetry, this has become a real nationalised account of suffering, which people in Treccolo now are referring to as if their forefathers experienced it firsthand. And it is a real fear, despite the fact that, historically speaking, in terms of historiography, it's an insignificant event to the region. So that is some of the things which the book deals about, all under the theme of recurring pasts in the present and how people experience the crisis according to the past. But what I wanted to talk about today was more to do with the future and imagining the future, and again, in terms of selective moments of the past. And I've stood here over the years and I've talked about fossils and historical imagination stimulated by fossil hunting in Treccolo, through renewable energy and these new armies of photovoltaic panels standing on people's land, and they're feeling they're occupied once again. Today, I'm going to talk about Star Trek. And excuse the lack of the exciting PowerPoint as well, that's all you're getting. So I'm trying to develop an idea of temporal vertigo, and John mentioned various collaborations I have, and the term temporal vertigo I have to accredit to my friend Charles Stewart, and I've asked him if it's okay to run with this idea of temporal vertigo, and it is. So temporal vertigo on the plane, on Greece's central plane, is what I'm going to talk about. Have you ever seen that programme Star Trek? Despina asked me as we walked through the weekly fruit and veg market in Treccolo on the central plains of mainland Greece. I remember as a child, she nudges me in the side with her elbow to make sure I'm paying attention. I remember watching William Shatner and that guy with the big pointy ears race around outer space, jumping to warp speed and collapsing any preconceptions us humble humans in 1970s Earth might have ever had of space and time. I drew a picture of William Shatner on the front of my school exercise book. I used to kiss him goodnight. She recoils in feigned embarrassment and continues. And then, when I was at university in the 1990s, I got into the new Star Trek series with Captain Jean-Luc Picard and his commander, William Riker, that womanizer. The Next Generation it was called, you know. I nod vigorously in agreement, as I just so happened to be rewatching the series. Wow, I was in love with Patrick Stewart, that bold beauty of a man. Absolutely besotted I was, she says. I probed Despina as to why she, seemingly out of the blue, started reminiscing about a cult sci-fi series while walking through a somewhat mundane Monday fruit and veg market this crisp morning in 2014. I knew that Star Trek had been a national phenomenon in 1970s Greece, but a decision to bring up the topic now had caught me unawares. She continues, well, as all people here, all these stall attendants, the families, they are experiencing a temporal flux. Time is no longer what it seems. Now, this is a phrase that I've heard repeated in Treccolo since the onset of economic crisis in 2009, as locals attempt to articulate their feelings of history repeating itself, time standing still, and being thrown back to previous times of suffering. These are all phrases, colloquialisms, used to explain their experience of time. Despina continues, temporal vortices, time travel, temporal anomalies, fluxes, wormholes, travelling faster than the speed of light, getting stuck in time loops, where you repeat the same activities day after day upon end. These, Despina assures me, were the crazy things about Star Trek that actually makes you stop and think about your own life experiences. She admitted that over the past 3 years, she had once again started watching the Star Trek series to try to get a better understanding of her own experience, as well as put the struggles of her own life into perspective. Now, I've written quite extensively on living with the consequences of prolonged economic austerity and how this has sharpened people's experiences of time and temporality in central Greece. The crisis has created a sense of temporal vertigo in Treccolo, intense confusion where the past provides direction, comfort and justification to the present and to the immediate future. When discussing economic crisis, narrators jump from recounting oppression during the Ottoman era to occupation during World War II and the stock market crash at the turn of the 21st century. which I all unpack at length in the book. They often claim to be reliving past areas of crisis, as if linear senses of time has collapsed. As I've argued in this room a couple of years ago, actors are bounce around through the past, paying little attention to linear temporal distance, condensing events that are seemingly separated by decades, sometimes centuries of linear time, into singular meaningful moments in the present. This provides some form of meaning to their uncertain futures. Their experience of the multiple temporalities of crisis is often articulated through material artifacts or popular culture. For instance, through objects such as photovoltaic panels that stand on farmland and represent high-tech, ultra-modern futures on the one hand, as well as being neo-colonial projects of extraction on the other. Fossils that trigger ideas of how the past is preserved, only to be later unearthed. Perhaps items of food that are symbolic of previous times of famine and present the fears of hunger in the near future. Slogans that resonate with other historical epochs. All these are ways that people talk about their present crisis and imaginations of the future. In Turricola, people discuss their worries of returning to the past eras of hardship while drawing courage that even the worst events can be overcome, that they will eventually emerge from this crisis situation. So it's not all doom and gloom. This does provide some sort of strength that these crises can be overcome. We've gone through worse. Our fathers have gone through worse. Our grandparents have gone through worse. We've come through famine. We've come through occupation. We can get through this. So this article explores two ways in which there is a sense of temporal vertigo in Turricola. The belief that people are going back in time to previous eras, and the idea that moments in time, selective pasts, have been stitched together in the present. In both cases, locals argue that linear notions of time, as a sequential progression of events, have been ruptured by crisis. My research participants report time having slowed down, to be going backwards, to be repeating itself in a continuous time loop, adding to a sense of temporal confusion. Exploring temporal vertigo requires suspending assumed interpretations of past and present, as well as the tacit agreements about the social and cultural norms attributed to time. So for Despina, now aged 44, who closed her shop selling beauty products in 2012 and has 2 sons living at home despite gaining degrees from Greek universities, Star Trek provides the perfect medium through which to discuss her temporal vertigo. It helps her to connect the unusual to a proximate and intimately embodied complex of human activity, as Deborah Battaglia has argued. She uses the familiarity of Star Trek to confront and translate the blind spots of temporal experience, which have arrived as a complete surprise on the scene of her sleepy life in central Greece. Talking about temporal phenomena encountered in Star Trek, Despina rhetorically asks, do I belong to a time of foreign occupation, or am I free and modern? These market stalls that you see around you, these do not make people money. Can you seriously say that what you see, this Balkan-like third world chaos, is part of a modern Europe? She says that her friends and family are posing similar questions. I feel closer connection to the time of my deceased grandmother than to the time of my son, she tells me. Our times are closer. I am reliving her life. I asked Despina to explain what she means by the closeness of times, for this is something I've heard about the proximity of specific events, such as the Great Famine of 41-43, Nazi occupation, the military dictatorship, how these paths are proximate to the present. She replies that the life experience of her grandmother, who was born in Greek Macedonia while still under Ottoman rule, consisted of extreme poverty. The most important aspect of everyday life, she says, was looking for a way to survive, where to find the next meal, how to dodge the latest invader. But she was always upbeat and optimistic. My 24-year-old son plays on his PlayStation all day and is apathetic about his future. Why should he have any hope? His future is already destroyed, she says. We have hit a vortex, an anomaly that causes all this confusion. Where we belong? Where do we belong? Which way are we going? She's lost her trajectory in time, going backwards, going forwards. We are stuck, she says, adrift on a sandbar. Despina is pessimistic about recovery and emergence from crisis. She sees no end in sight to this black hole of debt, austerity measures, and increasing poverty. Nothing can be done to stop Greeks from being pulled back into another era through falling through the vortex. Despite the whole high-profile protest on the streets of Athens and the rise to power of a left-wing, that was a slip, Freudian slip maybe, left-wing radical government, Despina remarks that resistance is futile to Troika-imposed austerity and the vested interest of opportunistic politicians, both left and right. We will be assimilated, she says. As a result, she sees no emergence from this time twister, this sandbar, and she concludes, anyway, the futures that we were promised are already history. So like Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, being blown backwards towards the future, while contemplating the ruins of the past, locals stitch together specific moments in time, paying little attention to temporal distance, as in terms of historiography. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption or emergence, and thus holds a claim over the present through moments of history that flit up to be recognised again in present times of danger and suffering. In the context of the Greek economic crisis, one could claim that the past redeems a population that feels abandoned by mainstream politics, acting as a guide to lost souls. Accounting for the countercurrents, pauses, and ruptures in the manner that time is experienced is what I explore here in the idea of temporal vertigo, created by economic crisis, and perceived by local people as terms of falling back through time, multiple pasts being superimposed into the present, and the emergence from perpetual crisis towards a potential future. So to understand the feelings of cyclical pasts and emerging futures, one has first to focus on the present, I propose. The present, Benjamin argues, is under stress from encompassing the entire history of mankind at a single moment in an enormous abridgment, and the idea of planning for immediate circumstances rather than the near or long term is a facet of 21st century neoliberalism. This focus on presentism allows for actors to channel their resources into day-to-day survival, into the now time that is loaded with splinters of the past. In relation to economic schedules, Gaia notes that the thinning out of complexity in collective near futures for policy to be enshrined in doctrine and guidelines defined by a more distant future, as is currently the case with the punishing austerity measures imposed on Greece, which deal with the present problems but with little regard for the near or mid-term future. This has left people feeling abandoned as they will never experience firsthand the long-term future which the current hardship is supposed to serve. Exhaustion after 6 years of crisis, apparently without respite anytime soon, has defeated imaginations of scenarios for a better future. Interest in the post-apocalyptic is a bridge too far for exhausted people. Feelings of resignation and helplessness are expressed by both younger and older generations. The future has been firmly defeated, and importantly, there is no preparation for a future that the next generation can find. Older people know that they will not be around to live the post-apocalyptic future, and exhausted youngsters have written themselves out of the future, which they see as overwhelmingly based on distrust, contempt, and apathy. For my research participants, the uncertainty caused by austerity requires the critical contemplation of everyday activities, which induces moments of anxiety and stress, moments when the present becomes uncanny. The present is caught in suspended animation. Through her work in Cyprus, Rebecca Bryant considers why people discuss fears of recurring and repeating traumatic pasts. Following Janet Reutman's reading that an event becomes a crisis because it shows how the world could be otherwise, Rebecca Bryant maintains that crisis represents a critical threshold outside of normal time. She argues that at a time of crisis, we acquire a sense that what we do in the present will be decisive to both the past and the future, giving the present a status of a threshold. Crisis, Bryant claims, becomes such precisely because it brings the present into consciousness, creating an awareness or perception of presentness that we do not normally have. The present becomes uncanny. The familiar becomes strange. It feels peculiar. And I always think that giving a presentation like this can be an uncanny present. You have an ultra consciousness of what you're doing. You suddenly realize that you exist, that you're in front of an audience, that you have to do something. And it reminds me of Dimitrios' crisis of presence. Having somebody being on the wall, looking down at yourself, giving the presentation, being acutely aware of being outside and having to do something. So the present feels distorted and disturbed due to the looming edifice of crisis leaking through its cracks. For Bryant and for my research participants alike, in particular, the present becomes uncanny due to the social interrogation of the now, and it usually unquestions links between the past, present, and future, so the timeline becomes disrupted. Poppy, a housewife in her 40s and mother to an 11-year-old son, discusses her increased anxiety about the present and the immediate future, something that she says she is trying to understand through accessing the past. Since she lost her job in the public sector 3 years ago, Poppy has taken to visiting the Tricolor Town Library to try to gain a better understanding of the political and economic forces at work in the present crisis, and to read up on local history. She says, "When I lost my job, I was so anxious. I sat at home all day, waiting for the clock to tick round. For the first year, it was as if time stood still. Or at least it seemed like everything was happening in slow motion." Poppy became acutely aware that her life was passing her by. She felt that she was operating on a different timescape to others around her. She says, "What can you do? We have had crisis in our lives 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 6 years. Those 6 years feel like 50. No exaggeration." This is something that I've been regularly told in Tricolor, that the crisis seems to have lasted a lifetime. "Has it really only been 6 years?" an elderly man remarked in a supermarket queue, on being cheerfully greeted by a cashier who had narrowly avoided redundancy in a recent round of job cuts. A young unemployed man with a university education complains that his life is dragging. "The last 6 years have passed so slowly. It is as if Greece has always been in crisis. I cannot remember what life was like before the crisis. It is surreal. Maybe there is no such thing as pre-crisis Greece. It might be a myth," he says. He mournfully and ironically laments. So this is a myth of pre-crisis that mirrors the myth of post-crisis. The feeling intensifies the feeling of being trapped in the present, the now time, without escape. The 24/7 media coverage that infiltrates every aspect of life heightens this notion of being surrounded, swamped, and suffocated by the crisis. Poppy continues, "I decided that I have to try my best to keep living my life as normally as possible, because the situation is totally out of my control. Bureaucrats and politicians in Berlin and Brussels will decide if I have a future or not. They will decide if I live or die." Poppy got to the point of having regular panic attacks because of anxiety about providing food and shelter for her son. She says, "Suddenly the life of my grandparents felt very close. They died many years ago, but as a child I heard their stories of poverty in their mountain village. I decided to go to the library and learn more about their times, their history." Poppy picked up her narrative by stating that she hoped to better understand their existence by reading up on the past and wider issues of politics and history. She says, "I suppose that it is now very important what I do today, because I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. For my son, there may well be no tomorrow, and I want to understand why." So in the book especially, I say how I found the work of Michel Serres, the French philosopher, inspiring as a muse to think through some of these ideas that are coming up through the ethnography. I am a believer in letting the ethnography guide the theory. And Michel Serres talks a lot about how he fears the recurrence of a famine and a lot of the destructive activities that he experienced as a child back in the 1940s. And also makes the claim that you do not have to experience these firsthand in order to have them a lasting traumatic, I hate to get into the trauma paradigm, but let's use that word for now, a traumatic effect on your life throughout. So there's a whole section in the book about Michel Serres and how he talks about proximate pasts. So I found the work of Michel Serres inspirational in helping think through the ethnographic material concerning non-linear time and the embodiment of the past in the present. According to Serres, it is often a common assumption that time is linear that distorts the perception that some events are apparently distant. Human relationships to time subjectively vary and are often convoluted. Serres argues that time doesn't pass, it percolates, it passes and it doesn't pass. It filters. One flux passes through while another does not. It gets caught in the filtration process. Some segments of the past get caught in the filtration process, they remain contemporary. They remain proximate. At times of dramatic social change, people in Trikala draw on these events to decipher present-day circumstances and render them, if not bearable, then at least surmountable and overcomable. Time, Sara suggests, at first appears to be flowing like a river passing beneath a bridge, the Heraclitean view of time. However, one fails to consider the invisible counter-currents running beneath the surface in the opposite direction, or the hidden turbulences that remain out of sight to the casual observer. Locals draw on the past, emergent aspects of the present, and visions of the future to assemble their crisis experience. An object, such as a photovoltaic panel, an item of food, even a fossil, or the interpretation of a 1960s and 70s television program, as in Star Trek, reveals how people seem time to be polychromic, topological, gathered together in multiple pleats. Approaching the experience of time as non-linear leads Sara to the idea of assemblage, that events, he suggests, exist part in their own era and part as an assemblage of reconstituted historical fragments. Crisis experience is an active synthesis, a scrambling of moments of the past. This is in contrast to common perceptions of events being constrained in their own time, to their own period, unable to communicate beyond their own boundaries, imprisoning history and critical events, suffocating the remarkable connections between seemingly distant episodes. People in Trikala are experiencing the financial crisis in terms of seemingly heterogeneous historical moments knitted together. Sourced from many temporal points, the Ottoman and Axis occupations, the Great Famine, civil war, military junta, these moments are fused together to form an assemblage of their contemporary experience. For my research participants, their future trajectory has become uncertain, highlighted by diverse coping strategies and increased unease surrounding notions of belonging and temporal trajectory. Are they heading forwards or backwards, or caught in a cyclical, uncanny present where there is no escape? The feeling of being trapped between paths of poverty and destitution and promised but hopeless futures is a core theme to crisis narratives in Trikala. A close friend of mine named Thanos is in his early 60s. He is a local doctor who expresses his feelings of temporal flux in terms of belonging. He says, "We are constantly told that Greece belongs to a modern, futuristic West, a modern, futuristic, prosperous Europe. At this point, he gives special reference to European Union-backed programs, such as renewable energy initiatives, as well as highlighting the extensive political rhetoric coming out of Brussels, Berlin, and Athens concerning Greece's legitimate place in the Eurozone and the European Union. But then, he says, we are left cold at night due to the cost of the central heating. We see people searching through rubbish bins or chasing ducks on the river for food. Our children are unemployed. My sister even helps at the local soup kitchen. Surely, Thanos passionately remarks, leaning across the desk and squeezing my hand. We are flying back in time. This is the sense that I get from my patients. They have lost their sense of belonging, their position on the timeline. For many, the future doesn't exist. There is no emergence from the present. There's only a reverse gear." Another informant, Dimitrios, explains his confusion as to where and when he is. "Everything is happening at once," he says. "We have had the Great Famine on our doorstep. The Germans have sparked another occupation. I pay my taxes as if I live in the Ottoman Empire, and Europe is like a foreign dictator. The kids are even shouting slogans last heard during the junta. All history is happening at once." Dimitrios, who's in his 30s and makes a living selling illegally felled firewood used by people to heat their homes, says that he recognizes an assemblage of different moments of the past converging on present-day life in Trikala. But he is confused. Indeed, he says he feels dizzy, light-headed, by the contradictory rhetoric coming from the Prime Minister in Athens and the bureaucrats in Brussels and Berlin. They say that we are suffering all this pain in order to build a brighter future, a future together in a rich and prosperous Europe. But we have been returned back to times of wartime peasantry in order to build our so-called future. It just doesn't make sense, he says. In Dimitrios' word, Greece has become stuck between the archaic wartime peasantry and backwardsness and the futuristic high-tech European hypermodernity. He notes that even former Prime Minister Antonis Samaras spoke of the punishing austerity ravishing the country, leading to unacceptable levels of poverty and suffering. But in his next breath, Samaras promised free Wi-Fi for nationwide as one of his leading policies. This helps create the explicit temporal vertigo reported by my informants. And it's one of the other papers, and I think this is also in the book, talks quite explicitly about this idea of how people talk on the one hand about archaic, pre-modern, pre-European, feeling like they're belonging to the past, and also being promised high-tech, futuristic, ultra-modern futures. And this is really illustrated by this photovoltaic panel sort of explosion that we have on the plains of Thessaly, whereby you can go up to the top of the house where I stay in Trickle and look out over these plains, and you can see field upon field full of photovoltaic solar panels. Now this promises this is high-tech, ultra-modern, European Union-endorsed, futuristic technology, but they don't actually serve the local population. The energy produced is used used as energy for big towns, and it's also the idea of exporting it to Germany and to Northern Europe. So as it gets dark, this smog descends over the town, and you can no longer see out of the house. You can't see the photovoltaic panels because of the toxic smog that's come down, as people have resorted to burning whatever they can get their hands on, their jakia with the xylosombers, in order to stay warm at night. They can't afford the petrol prices anymore, the oil prices to heat the home. So on the one hand, you have the futuristic high-tech technology, but because it's not serving the people, they've resorted to what they term archaic, pre-modern, pre-European, as we were back in the village, pre-1960s, ways to survive. And it's a paradox. So I'm going to move on to talk about the idea of emergence towards the future and imaginations of the future. In summer 2014, then Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras made a bold statement that got my research participants contemplating potential futures of a post-crisis nation. In May 2014, the Prime Minister triumphantly announced, "We have growth. We have come out of the crisis. Greece can once again borrow money. We can get loans. We did it together. We have officially emerged from the crisis." Although laughed off as hollow political rhetoric by a large section of the Greek population suffering from the consequences of Troika austerity measures, the Prime Minister's words sparked public debate about what emergence and a post-crisis future might look like. Citing moments of the past as a way to understand the current crisis has led to an intimacy with the critical events that some informants find comforting, knowing that the past offers a deal of security and direction to their turbulent lives. Being suspended in time, in a crisis that has lasted a lifetime, a dominant collective voice in Trikala suggests that people have learnt to cope with the decreasing living standards and tighter budgets. They have managed to contain the crisis situation and fear the prospect of an emergent post-crisis nation. Furthermore, many locals report having become habituated to the idea of emergence as a never-ending cyclical process. Emergence from crisis, as indeed crisis as a term itself, is a means to think through regular everyday encounters, structuring imaginations of the future. The intimacy felt with the crisis situation and its incessant anticipation of emergence has fed into the idea of being stuck in this never-ending cycle. Anticipation suggests a means to predetermine or reveal the outcome of an occurrence at some future time, by stretching one's intuition over a specific time period. Anticipation can be a thought of a bridging of the anxious gap between perception and certain knowledge, allowing people to act as if they know their futures. The anticipation of emergence works from a present to fold the past into the unknowable future. A conversation with a 33-year-old waitress called Vassal is representative of how people have become over-familiar with the idea of emergence, and they no longer believe in it. "We've heard it so many times," she says. "The crisis is over. The economy is improving. But these are not just words. One experiences a déjà vu. It's a physical feeling of repetition. It makes you dizzy. It gives you palpitations. Emergence, crisis, emergence, crisis, emergence." Vassal feels anxious and confused when she hears talk about Greece's future. And she says, "I now feel threatened by what the future may hold, the unknowable direction of our fatherland will take. For 5 years we have lived with the crisis 24/7, and we have had to learn to adapt. We have taken lessons from the past to craft some of our form of existence, and just when we've learnt how to live with these renegotiated terms, suddenly our future is up in the air again. Are we really emerging from crisis? Is there another piece of political rhetoric? What might this new time look like for me, for the future of my children? So once again, the threat of emergence into uncertain trajectories is based on historically endorsed fears that people will be thrown backwards into even worse times of uncertainty and hardship. Emergence can, according to Zizek, undermine every stable scheme. Vassal says that people now know what they need to do to survive, and that fearing that one neo-colonial programme of dispossession will simply be replaced by another, she remarkably says that she's happy to remain with the status quo. So she's fearful of what will be afterwards. She fails to imagine a post-crisis nation. At least in the present, we can now know our position in history. We can take comfort from familiarity and the fact that we have adapted to serve our basic needs. Perhaps Vassal's words are representative of how people in Trikala feel downtrodden, exhausted by 6 years of crisis talk, and able to stimulate imaginations for alternative futures, an intimacy with crisis that breeds a kind of Stockholm syndrome. She seems resigned, disenchanted with her own government, and believes that the so-called crisis is no longer a passing phase, but a chronic long-term situation that should, for now, be accepted as an unavoidable facet of both the present and her future. Her parting remarks are pertinent here. She says, "The past has taught us that these crises can be overcome, but in what way? Once we are told that we have overcome this moment of history, the current crisis, what then? How can we position ourselves for a future which is unknown?" Vassal is stuck in her present, taking guidance from her familiar pasts, and to emerge suggests something new, something different, and only potentially something better. For Vassal, the Prime Minister's promise of emergence represents an elongation of the critical present and the reliving of painful pasts, rather than a promising new future. Despite its indexical relation to newness, Sam Collins argues that the trope of emergent tends to recapture its own potential, to foreclose the possibilities of futures by containing within it the past-present relation. For Collins, the key problem is that there is still usually little surprise to what emerges. Typically neoliberal projects emerging in their own image, which is exactly what's happened with the solar energy drive on the plain of Thessaly. People have bought into, or felt there's been no other way but to buy into a neoliberal scheme to plan for short-term futures, just to put food on the table for tomorrow. But by doing that, they have to take out bank loans, especially for agriculturalists. So they're building up their debt, and they're playing exactly the same game as what got them into the mess in the first place. So they are feeling forced to just perpetually build futures on the same rules of neoliberalism as their past, of which just destroyed their past. So I decided to take up the conversation of the déjà vu of emergence and post-crisis futures with Vespina, of opening narrative fame, the Star Trek fan, who suggested that post-crisis futures may be constructed in terms of sci-fi post-apocalyptic futures. You know, like the Hollywood films, she says, there's a huge disaster, a crisis if you like, and then Earth is inhabited by mindless zombies. Or there might be a deadly virus, or people left to fight off the machines. She pauses to dwell on her last sentence. She says, well, actually, I guess we are fighting the machine, the system, but that is nothing new for Greeks. We fought off the Ottomans, we fought off the Germans, we fought the fascists. Now we're fighting off a new enemy. So you can understand why we all feel as though we've been here before. Vespina concludes that there is nothing new in this world, that life is full of déjà vu and stories that are assemblages of moments of the past. So in this presentation, I'm trying to demonstrate how messy an ethnography of time can be. On the one hand, my research participants describe being thrown back in time to previous eras of poverty and suffering. On the other hand, they're discussing the present as an amalgamation, an assemblage of disparate pasts, which they say they are now reliving. When discussing the current economic crisis, people in Trikala make temporal leaps, skipping from discussing the early 19th century Ottoman era to 21st century austerity Greece, collapsing stories of life under Ottoman landlords with life in Nazi-occupied Thessaly, and condensing nationalist accounts with personal experiences. They bounce around through the past, knitting together disparate events that feel temporally and culturally close to their current circumstances. This all adds to the sense of temporal vertigo experienced in Trikala today. confusion as to where and to when one belongs, culminating in reports of feeling dizzy and nauseous. This is the elsewhere and the elsewhen of being lost in time, as Deborah Battaglia has argued. Deborah Battaglia, as some of you know, writes on extraterrestrials of all things. She's an anthropologist, but she's got some great ideas. The past offers some direction and stability to the situation of high anxiety, especially when people express explicit fears about what the future might hold. There is also the sense that the present is never-ending, perpetually caught in the temporal ricochets between past and the future. Exhausted and disillusioned, people are trapped in cyclical events from which there is no escape, stranded on the temporal sandbar, as Desmond puts it. With this in mind, perhaps it should be of no surprise that Star Trek helps people like Despina contemplate their relationship to time, with stories of temporal paradoxes, cyclical and anomalous time, of time travel. For Despina, the fictional exploration of extraterrestrial phenomena in the cosmos provides an enduring horizon for meaning-making and futures, where she can question the many assumptions about world-making projects, such as this current regime of neoliberal reform. When, echoing the tagline from an infamous Star Trek bad guys, the Borg, she says, resistance is futile, she not only refers to the feeling of uncontrollably plummeting back through the vortex of time, but also the resignation and resistance to troika austerity, and the associated temporal confusion that this causes, she says, is pointless. Like Despina, many people feel that the situation of chronic austerity is out of their control, with international creditors and national governments, left and right, behaving as they please, defeating imaginations of better futures. So sci-fi, fossils, as I've argued here before, renewable energy infrastructures, and items of food offer rich metaphors for understanding the temporal relationships between resurfacing histories and uncertain futures. This fractured fairy tale of futures once promised as a birthright in European neoliberal world have been thrown into disarray, and local people are turning to meaningful shards of the past to make sense of crisis experience. But the familiarity with people or feelings of history repeating itself with the temporal spin cycle has also led to a sense of comfort and security with some people in the present crisis situation. For some, the emergent future, it seems, is more daunting than the painful past. So as Charles Stewart and I have recently argued in our special issue of History and Anthropology that John mentioned, which is actually a collection of 9 essays that is one of the, we believe it's the first comparative study of living with austerity across southern Europe. So we've got articles from Portugal, from Spain, from Italy, from Cyprus, and from Greece. We're trying to see in a comparative manner how economic crisis has stimulated temporal thought, whether tilted, like I said, in the terms of historicizing, presentifying, or futural thought, and how people are provoked to rethink their relationship to time. My studies of actually living with austerity identify the ways the past may be activated, lived, embodied, and refashioned under contracting economic horizons. The empirical study of crisis catches the decisions and non-decisions that people make, and the actual temporal processes by which they judge the response. Modern linear historicism is often overridden in such moments by modes of temporalizing and historicizing. In crises, not only time, but history itself, as an organizing structure and set of expectations, is up for grabs, and can be refashioned according to new rules. Thank you.